Okay, so good evening, everybody. We're going to go ahead and get our class started on the intertestamental period tonight. We're going to be talking about Judea under Roman rule. Again, just like we've done in the past, I have the live feed up on my iPad on Facebook, and so I'm watching the comments. If you've got some questions that you'd like to ask during the course of the class, just go ahead and type those in the comments section. I'll be happy to answer those as we go through the class. Hopefully, I can keep an eye on it so we're not too far along or too terribly far along when I actually see the question. We've had some good questions in this class, and we've had some good questions in the Revelation class that I teach on Wednesdays and Sundays. I hope those questions will keep coming as we talk about this period of history between the two testaments, between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the intertestamental period. It's an important period of history. It's an important period to talk about because it gets us from what things are like in the Old Testament to what things are like in the New. From a historical standpoint, probably most of us are aware of the fact that when the Old Testament closes, the Jews are living under Persian rule. And then all of a sudden we open up with the book of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and we end up now with the Jews living under Roman control, and a lot of things happen in between that. And so in this intertestamental class, those are the kinds of things that we're talking about. How we got from where we ended in the Old Testament to where we were at the beginning of the New Testament. So tonight, Judea under Roman rule. Last week we talked about the rise of Rome, so we talked a lot about Roman history, how these little villages on the Tiber were able to conquer the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. Last week when we finished that class, we had a map that looked like this. As a matter of fact, we used this exact same map that showed the Roman Empire in 133 BC. And so the pink areas there are Roman provinces. The areas that are shaded with pink dashed lines are not a part of the Roman Empire in 133 BC. There's some independent kingdoms that might have been to some extent under Roman control, but they weren't a part of the Roman Empire itself. The dark pink represents the Roman provinces, so the extent of the Roman Empire. Of course, Judea and Jerusalem are way down here. And you can notice that at this point in time, in 133 BC, they are still a part of the Seleucid Empire. And so that is going to change radically. As a matter of fact, let's go ahead and pull up another map. This is the Roman Empire in 117 AD. And at this point in time, the empire has expanded pretty dramatically. The Jews are no longer outside of the empire. You'll notice down here, Judea is an imperial province, so it's a part of the Roman Empire. Of course, Egypt is now a part of Rome, all the way across northern Africa. The border of the empire stretches all the way north to northern England, just short of Scotland, and it stopped here by the German tribes just on the other side of the border. And so the Roman Empire has expanded considerably from 133 BC to 117 AD. And so we spent time talking last week about the rise of Rome, how that was able to happen. Tonight we're very much focusing on what's going on with the Jews under Roman rule and some aspects of being under Roman rule. And when we talk about that, I tell you what, I want to go back to that map real quick because I want to emphasize one thing about this before we go on. And that's if you look down here, you've got Judea. Judea, of course, this area out here is desert. So we talk about the border of the Roman Empire. It's true it was the border, but there really isn't much out here anyways. But these areas out here are pretty close to Judea. So Judea is in a border region, which makes it strategically very important to the Roman Empire. And so what happens in Judea is not going to escape notice of the folks that are calling the shots in the city of Rome, the emperors. And so as we talk about things tonight, and as we note how the Romans deal with the Jews, we need to keep in mind that this is a border area, and it was an area that they had a great concern in keeping peaceful and keeping well within their empire and their sphere of influence. All right, so let's talk then about Judea under Roman rule, and the first significant date for us is 63 BC. You may remember in an earlier class, we talked about this date because we're talking about what's going on with the Seleucid Empire, the Seleucid Kingdom. 63 BC is that significant date because it's in this year that the Roman general Pompey intervenes in the struggle between Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, both of whom are Hasmoneans. So when we talked about the Seleucids and we talked about the Hasmonean kingdom, we talked about these two, Aristobulus II and Hyrcanus II, and the fact that there's these struggles that are going on between them. Pompey intervenes in that struggle. In the course of that, the city of Jerusalem is besieged, and then it falls. In the fall of Jerusalem, about 12,000 Jews are killed, and then Judea is incorporated into the Roman province of Syria. I do see that we have a question, and I am going to get to that here directly. But let me finish up this slide first and the next slide, and then we'll go back and get that question. So Judea is incorporated into the Roman province of Syria. Hyrcanus, that's Hyrcanus II, he's named ethnarch. That title means, it literally means leader of the people. So he's named ethnarch of Judea. He's also confirmed as high priest. He's answerable to the Roman governor, but he is not called king. That's significant because at that point in time, Judea is now firmly under the control of the Roman Empire. Hyrcanus' territory included Judea, Galilee, Idumea, and Perea. We're going to see those places in just a moment on a map. Other areas are lost. So the Hasmonean kingdom had controlled Samaria. As a result of what goes on here with Pompey, some of those areas are lost as it becomes a part of the Roman Empire and becomes a province, specifically a part of the Roman province of Syria. All right, let's just pull up a map. And I highlighted in blue on the map the areas that Hyrcanus is actually going to rule after Pompey ends that dynastic struggle between he and his brother. So we've got Galilee in the north. We're pretty familiar with that as New Testament students. We kind of know where Galilee is. We've got Judea in the south. Again, we're pretty familiar with that as well. City of Jerusalem is in Judea. Two other places that we don't tend to be terribly familiar with are Idumea, that's down here south of Judea, and Perea, which is to the northeast of Judea. But notice with me, if you will, that other areas are lost. And so all these green areas had been a part of the Hasmonean kingdom. They're taken away. And significantly, what you have here is Samaria being taken away, which means you're going to have a gap between a predominantly Jewish area in the north, Galilee, and another predominantly Jewish area in the south, Judea. And so probably a lot of what's going on here is Pompey is trying to make sure that Hyrcanus II is not able to consolidate his power. And he's just trying to keep him weak. The Romans did that frequently, that when they ruled over people, they would rule in such a way that the people that could potentially cause them problems are kept in a weakened state so they're not able to cause those problems. Okay, the question that was asked is, what is the difference between a senatorial and an imperial province? The difference is in who was administering it. So some provinces were imperial. They were administered directly through the empire, through the emperor. So the emperor would appoint who would be ruling over that province, the governor of that province. Other provinces were senatorial, which meant the Senate was the one that was appointing who were going to be governors over that. And they might not have even called them governors. I'm not 100% sure about that. The long and short is what you had is you have still the republican forms in the Roman Empire. So you have the Senate and you have senators, but the main power is in the emperor. However, to keep the Senate somewhat happy, because these folks were pretty scheming at times, certain provinces would have been left under senatorial control. For our purposes in the class, it really doesn't matter whether it was a senatorial or an imperial province. It had to do really about how that province was administered. All right, so I hope I answered that question for you. So 63 AD, very significant date, because at this point in time, Judea, and hence the Jews, are now living under Roman rule. Now, we talk about Judea. I need to stress that when we talk about Judea, we kind of lump Galilee in that as well. Really, I could have titled this class differently. I could have said Jews, the Jews under Roman rule. However, there are a lot of Jews that are living outside of Judea and Galilee, and I really didn't want to necessarily include them in this class. So I just used, for the sake of shortness, calling it Judea under Roman rule, but much of what we're saying is applicable to Galilee and Idumea as well. All right, so as the Romans are administering their empire, and specifically here in Judea, the Romans are going to rule through various puppet rulers. At first, those are the Hasmoneans. We see that here in 63 with Hyrcanus II being ethnarch and being high priest, and he's got some areas that he's ruling over, but he is a puppet of the Romans, and he understands that. The Romans understand that. Nobody has any illusions that somehow he's independent. So they rule through the Hasmoneans at first. Later, they're going to rule through the Herods. Now that's going to be the subject of our next class. Next Thursday night, we're going to talk about the Herods, because when you get to the pages of the New Testament, you've got Herod the Great, you've got other Herods that are mentioned. Who are these guys? What are they all about? We're going to talk about that next Thursday night. But they're going to be puppet rulers under the Romans. So the Romans are going to rule Judea through these Herods. The Herods were a family, okay? They're also going to rule Judea through Roman governors that also play an important role. So, for example, when we get to the New Testament, we find Jesus on trial. And we find him on trial before Pontius Pilate. We also see him on trial before Herod. What's going on there? Well, it has to do with the interplay between Roman governors and these puppet rulers and the areas that they're administering. Okay, I had a question here. Explain what you mean by lost. I'm going to confess right now that I'm not real sure I understand that question. So if the questioner there, Sister Lee, if you would just reword that for me, that way I can understand your question. I'll give a shot at answering that. Okay, while she's doing that, I'm going to go ahead and continue on here in the chart. So we have these puppet rulers. The boundaries of Judea are going to shift over time. At times, Jewish areas are ruled by descendants of Herod the Great. At other times, by Roman governors. And this is fairly complex history, but again, we don't have to go into the complexities of that for the class. But the Romans have a system of keeping these peoples that are under their control in check with various ways, and they do that through these puppet rulers. So Judea is under Roman rule various times, under the Hasmoneans, under the Herods, under the Roman governors. What we find with Judea and the Jews in this area is that there's going to be a series of rebellions. Probably most of us are somewhat familiar with the main one that we're going to talk about tonight that we haven't gotten to yet. And that's in 70 AD. Well, it culminates in 70 AD with the destruction of Jerusalem. We're going to get to that in just a little while. But there are a series of rebellions that precede that. So, for example, in 57 BC, there's a rebellion that's led by Alexander. Alexander is the son of Aristobulus II. Remember, there's a dynastic struggle between Hyrcanus II, Aristobulus II. Hyrcanus II wins with Pompey's help. Alexander is Aristobulus' son. He's not very happy about this. So in 57 BC, which is only about 6 years after Pompey takes over, he's going to lead a rebellion against Roman rule. Now, the result of that rebellion is that Hyrcanus II loses all political autonomy. So it's not his rebellion, it's Alexander's rebellion, but Alexander is a part of the Hasmonean house. Hyrcanus is a part of the Hasmonean house, and so the result is Rome is going to take away the political autonomy, at least in name, that Hyrcanus up to this point had enjoyed. Well, in 56 BC, we get yet another rebellion. This time, Aristobulus himself leads a revolt. In 55 BC, Alexander leads yet another revolt, and he's defeated near Mount Tabor. So you have these rebellions that are going on that are really involving the house of the Hasmoneans, the Hasmonean house. Some of these remnants of that are leading these rebellions. You also get a feel for the fact that although the Romans are in control, they really haven't solidified that control very well yet. All right, so 55 BC. Then in 53 BC, we get yet another rebellion. This particular case, the Roman governor of Judea is killed in battle against the Parthians. Out to the east of the Roman Empire, there were the Parthians, and the Romans had a long-lasting struggle with the Parthians. And so in 53 BC, this Roman governor is leading an army out there. He's killed in battle. What results from that is that a fellow named Pythilaus leads a rebellion against Rome. After all, the governor's dead. Maybe we've got a shot here at doing something with this. The revolt is defeated. Pythilaus is killed. His followers are sold into slavery. That kind of matches a well-known pattern in how the Romans are going to deal with rebellion. You get rid of the leaders if it's convenient to do so. Those that are captured, they get sold into slavery. We're going to talk about slavery later in this class, by the way. Okay, the question that was asked is, you were showing the map of Roman rule and the area around you said some area you said lost. What did you mean by that statement? Well, it's going to go back to, I'm going to click on that slide. There we go. And pull that back up. And so the areas that we're talking about is Hyrcanus is given control. Let me go back and say that differently. The Hasmonean house in about 64, 65 BC controls everything in green on the map. That's the Hasmonean kingdom, okay? That represents their borders. When Pompey captures Jerusalem in 63 BC, Hyrcanus is going to be made ethnarch, but he's going to be limited in where he rules. So he's going to rule in Galilee up here. He's going to rule Perea. He's going to rule Judea, and he's going to rule Idumea. But areas like Moabitis on the other side of the Dead Sea, the Decapolis on the other side of the Jordan River, Iturea up here in the far north, okay, north of Galilee, and significantly Samaria here in the middle are going to be taken away from him. He's not going to rule those areas because he's now a part of the Roman province of Syria, and he only gets to rule what the Romans let him rule. So those areas are lost to the house of the Hasmoneans. They're still a part of the Roman Empire, okay? So everything there that's in green is a part of Rome, but it's no longer ruled by the Hasmoneans, that Jewish dynasty. All right, I hope that answers the question. Let me fast forward back in our slides here. Okay, so we had talked about Pythilaus' rebellion in 53 BC. What we find is that as time is going on, these rebellions are going to get fewer and fewer. The Romans are able to consolidate their rule. But there is a period of civil war and unrest in the Roman Empire. And that period will make life very precarious in Palestine. So if you think about Mark Antony, you think about Julius Caesar, you think about Cleopatra in Egypt. When I talk about that period of civil war, that's what I'm talking about. It's the ending of the Republic. And out of all these wars, we're going to end up with the Roman Empire. But in the meantime, when all this is going on, life is pretty precarious in Palestine because you don't know who you're supposed to be loyal to, and you don't know whose army is going to march through next. It is not a blessing to live in interesting times, because generally for most people, living in interesting times means they're living in very difficult times. So you have this period of civil war. Quite a few people in Jewish areas were unhappy living under Roman rule. Not everybody. There were a lot of Jews who thought, hey, this is great. We don't mind being a part of the Roman Empire. But a lot of people were unhappy about that. Once Augustus becomes emperor, the situation is going to calm down considerably. You may remember from studying in school something called the Pax Romana. What it means is the Roman peace. And Augustus is able to establish that so that generally speaking, at this point in time, things are pretty calm in the Roman Empire. There aren't a lot of rebellions going on. There aren't a lot of wars going on. People are peaceful. People are prosperous. And so when we get to the opening pages of the New Testament, generally speaking, we would call that the period of the Roman peace. It doesn't mean that there aren't any rebellions, but it means there just aren't as many. For example, there are a couple of rebellions. One of those was carried out by a fellow whose name was Judas of Galilee. He rebels against the Romans in 6 AD. Jesus would have been about 10 years old when that happened. I want you to think about that for just a moment. Judas of Galilee. Jesus is from Galilee. That was his home area. And so when Judas is leading this rebellion, Jesus would have been old enough to remember that. Another rebellion is carried out by a fellow whose name was Theudas. That was in about 44 to 46 AD. That's in the New Testament period. So that's when the the church has been established and the apostles are preaching the gospel. Christians are preaching the gospel. And here we have yet again in Judea another rebellion. But you see, as you get to 6 AD and then 44 AD, that now there's quite a lot of gap between the rebellions because things have settled down for the most part in Judea. Now, maybe they've settled down primarily because there are Roman legions there, but in any case, things have settled down. So we just get these significant rebellions in 6 AD and again in 44. Until we get to what's called, and we don't even call this a rebellion really, we get to the first Jewish-Roman war. It starts in 66. That's a typo, not BC. It starts in 66 AD, okay? And that's going to be a typo on all the following slides because I just copied that over and I didn't catch that. So sorry about that. 66 AD is when it starts and it goes all the way to 74. Well after the time of Jesus, okay? But still in the New Testament period. We've still got New Testament books that are being written during this period. The Revelation of John isn't going to be written until 96 AD, so about 20 years after this. So what are the causes of this Jewish-Roman war that's going to last 8 years? Well, one of those causes is that there are tensions between the Jews and the Greeks, the Jews and the Gentiles. Because what's happened in Palestine during this period is now there are a lot of pagans, Gentiles who are living in the area. And there's tension between them and the Jews because the Greeks, the pagans, have their own way of worshiping their gods, which is very different from the Jews. And so you get these religious tensions, and they're going to flare up, and that's going to lead to an ignition of this war. There is, of course, continued dissatisfaction with Roman rule. That doesn't ever really completely go away. I might just point out at this point in time that another cause of the Jewish-Roman war involves the prophecies of Matthew chapter 23 and 24. This is something that isn't politically correct necessarily to say, but it is absolutely what the Bible teaches, and that is that when this war breaks out and when the Romans end up destroying Judea and destroying the temple, it is in direct fulfillment of the prophecy that Jesus gives in Matthew chapter 23 and Matthew chapter 24. And if you read those passages, you'll find that Jesus makes that prophecy because the Jewish nation had rejected him and had rejected his apostles, or they were going to reject his apostles. And so Jesus says, because that's happened, your house is going to be left to you desolate. So yes, from an earthly standpoint, from a historical standpoint, we find these religious tensions, we find dissatisfaction with Roman rule, but we as Christians cannot rule out the fact that the Jewish-Roman war was a fulfillment of God's divine punishment upon the nation that had rejected his Son. Again, that's not politically correct. People don't like to talk about that, but that is, I believe, what the Bible teaches. So the Jewish-Roman war starts in 66 AD. The Roman military garrison of Judea, as well as King Agrippa II, we'll talk about him next Thursday night, are forced to flee. So when this gets started, this is not just a minor thing, because the Roman military that's there, they have to leave. They have to get out. They can't stay. King Agrippa, who's the king of this area, he has, and remember, he's a puppet king under the Romans, he has to leave as well. So let's look on. What's going on here with this Roman war? Again, 66 to 74 AD. I'll try not to say that again. Let's just all remember that. The rebels are able to defeat a Roman force at Beth Horon. You may remember when we talked about the Maccabean revolt, that there was a significant victory of the Maccabees, those Jewish rebels, under the Seleucid rule at Beth Horon. So yet again, we see a battle at Beth Horon. This time the Romans are defeated. In 67 AD, the Romans under General Vespasian invade Galilee. So the Romans are going to take care of Galilee first in the north before they turn their major attention to the south, to Judea. In 69 AD, Vespasian, that general, is proclaimed emperor. You may remember 69 AD is the year of the 4 emperors. There is terrible instability in the governance of the Roman Empire. And as a result of what's all going on over there, then people decide, hey, Vespasian, He needs to be the emperor. So he's proclaimed emperor, but he's fighting this war in Judea. So what he does is he leaves his son Titus to begin the siege of Jerusalem. Vespasian has to go back to Rome in order to be emperor. So Vespasian is leading things up to 69. From 69 on, it's his son Titus who's going to be fighting this war. And by the way, Titus is going to be the next Roman emperor after Vespasian. All right, let's show a map here. This is the first phase of the Jewish-Roman War. At least I got the date right here, right? 66 to 68 AD. There's some military activity down here in the south, okay? But most of the military activity is up here in the north. And so there's fighting. There's a siege at Jotapata and some other places as well. There's one over here at Gamla. We're going to see a picture of that in just a moment. So the Romans, as they're dealing with this rebellion, as they're dealing with this insurrection, they're going to deal with the northern territory first. They're going to deal with Galilee before they move down and take care of the south. That's the first phase of the war. Let's go ahead and look at the second phase then of the war. This is 69 to 74 AD. Nothing going on up in the north because that was already taken care of. This area was already pacified, if you will, during the first phase of the war. The second phase of the war is really centered down here and primarily centered at Jerusalem. Jerusalem is going to be besieged. It's going to fall. And after it falls, then there's going to be some other Roman military actions against some of the rebel strongholds at Machaerus and also at Masada. That's one that we tend to be familiar with. We're going to see some pictures of that in just a moment as well. So Jerusalem is the prize. We've got to conquer Jerusalem so that then we can mop up these other areas. So let's pull up the next slide. In 70 AD, after a siege lasting 7 months, the city of Jerusalem falls. So the Romans are going to have to besiege the city for 7 months in order to conquer it. There is, during this time, something else that's going on. You've got the Roman enemy on the outside of the walls, but within the city, you've actually got a civil war going on. There were Jewish factions in the city that were fighting among themselves while they had the Romans outside the walls. Because not all the Jews were on board with this rebellion thing. Not all the Jews agreed with how the rebellion was being carried out. So there's this civil war that's going on as well. The population of the city of Jerusalem was devastated during the siege. Okay, it is difficult to place a number on deaths. It has been estimated that up to 1 million people died in the siege and fall of Jerusalem. Jerusalem was filled up with people when the Romans came because they were there celebrating a Jewish festival. And so once they were there, they didn't get out. And so the population was just devastated. Hundreds of thousands, we're just going to be conservative and say hundreds of thousands of Jews died during the siege of Jerusalem. Many of the people of the city were crucified after trying to escape. So you've got these folks that are inside the walls of Jerusalem. They see the handwriting on the wall, if you will. They know the city's not going to stand. We don't want to be in here when all of this takes place. We know what the Romans are going to do. Let's try to slip out through the walls or over the walls, see if we can get away. Or maybe the Romans will take us captive and everything will be okay. Well, this is what the Romans viewed. When these Jews are coming out of the city, a lot of the Roman soldiers just assumed that these Jews had taken their valuables, their gold, their jewelry, their gemstones, and had swallowed them. So some of these poor Jews that ran out of the city, tried to escape the city, actually were disemboweled by the Romans so the Romans could see whether they were hiding any gold or not. Those that they didn't, they crucified. So you can picture the city, if you will. You've got the Jews on the inside of the city. You've got the city walls. You've got the Romans on the outside. And here, I would suspect almost every morning you would wake up, and if you went out and looked over the wall, you'd see more crosses springing up around the town of Jews that had tried to escape. The Romans catch them and they crucify them within the sight of the city. This is psychological warfare. It was terrorism. These people were no longer a threat to the Romans, but they were sending a message to the people within the city. Then once the Romans are able to breach the walls, thousands more died. But not everybody. There were survivors of the siege. Those survivors were, for the most part, sold into slavery. So they end up becoming slaves within the Roman Empire. Finally, the temple was burned and the city was destroyed. The Romans are not interested in allowing these people to rebel again. By the time we get to 70 AD, they have been dealing with this rebellion, this war, for 4 years, and the war is not over yet. Let's pull up a map of the siege of Jerusalem. It starts in March, goes all the way to September of 70 AD. And you will notice on the map that the Romans, first of all, you got your legion numbers up here. Roman legions were all numbered. So you've got some legions up here that move down from Galilee. You've got the 5th Roman legion that moves up from Emmaus. You've got the 10th Roman legion that moves in from Jericho. They're besieging the city. So you've got the city with its walls. The Romans are actually able to breach the walls, get inside the city, and they have actually a camp that is built within the city, a Roman camp. Romans built military camps, fortified camps, when they lead sieges. We're going to see some photos in a little while of what those look like, at least from a distance. So the Romans are able to get into part of the city, but this area of the city, you will notice there are more walls there. There were multiple walls in the city of Jerusalem. Various areas were walled off. And so these areas still have to fall. So the Romans build around this area a siege wall. That siege wall is to keep Jews from escaping. Because at this point in time, the Jews want to make sure that whoever's in that city is either going to die, going to be captured and sold into slavery. We do not want these people getting out, because if they do, they're going to go cause problems elsewhere. And indeed, they actually will cause problems elsewhere. So that's the siege and the fall of Jerusalem, but the war is not over. Following the siege from 70 to 74, the remaining strongholds, Jewish strongholds, are captured. In the spring of 74 AD, Masada, which was down near the Dead Sea, Masada had been a fortress that King Herod had built. We'll talk about King Herod next week. That fortress had been occupied by zealots. Okay, these were the most zealous, if you will, of the rebels against Roman rule. They had occupied that, and in 74 AD, that fortress finally falls. And that is the last significant opposition to Roman rule in Judea. So 66 to 74, it's a war that lasts 8 years. That's a long time, especially when you're dealing with the Romans. And they're not really expecting, at least at the beginning, for this to be a major problem. All right, I promised some photos. Let's go ahead and pull up some photos. The first of these is from Gamla, Galilee, which is called, or sometimes called, the Masada of the North. A city built on a hilltop, fortified. The rebels are able to go in there. The Romans have to besiege the city. In the foreground here, you see a reproduction of a Roman siege weapon, not a catapult, but this would actually be a weapon that would shoot a very, very large bolt, something like an arrow, something like a giant crossbolt as they're besieging the city. So that's Gamla, the Masada of the North. Let's talk about the actual Masada itself. This is an aerial view of Masada. Masada is down by the Dead Sea, pretty desolate area. Masada is this fortress up here on the top. Masada was built up on top of this hill. On every side, you've got a pretty steep incline for getting up there. So it's really, really difficult to get up there. And of course, the Romans are going to have to use their siege equipment to get up there and do some damage. So the Romans build a siege wall, again, around the fortress. This is after the fall of Jerusalem, okay? They build a siege wall to keep those zealots in. They don't want those people getting out, because if they get out, they're going to go somewhere else and cause problems. We see the remains of Roman camps. You see those down here, these boxes. They built these because if they didn't, they were afraid that those zealots, or whoever they were fighting, would come down out of that fortress and attack them at night. And so they built these walls around their camps. There's 3 over here. There's another one over here to protect the soldiers when they're in their camp at night. The main Roman camp is located up here at the top, in a little bit closer proximity to the fortress itself. Well, Masada is a pretty impregnable fortress, and so the Romans are going to have to spend a lot of effort to conquer this fortress. They can't leave it alone because you got zealots up there, and if you leave them alone, they're just going to, like I said, they're just going to cause problems elsewhere. So the Romans are forced to build a siege ramp, and you are looking in this photo at the remains of the siege ramp. Now, this may not be visible on your devices, I recognize that, but if you will look down here, that is a car. with a couple of people standing by it. It was very convenient for those people to be in this photo. There's some others that are walking up the hill and some others up here. That gives you an idea of the scale of the fortress of Masada, how high up it is. All of this that's built here, that's artificial. That's the siege ramp. It's the remains of it, okay? It's eroded over time, but the Romans are going to have to build this siege ramp to get their equipment up to the top so they can penetrate those walls. Now, the zealots in Masada are watching all of this, okay? They're watching the Romans build this siege ramp. They know what's coming. They're doing the best they can to fight from within their walls, from within this fortress, but they know it's only a matter of time. And so what we find out about these guys, the zealots that are in there with their wives and children, absolutely do not want to be captured by the Romans. They know what it means. They know that all the men are going to die. They know the women are going to be sold into slavery. They know the children are going to be sold into slavery. Now, I got to tell you, we're going to talk about slavery later in this class, but slavery was a very difficult situation for anybody. In the Roman world, slaves could be sexually misused by their owners. And so you got these guys that know what's going to happen to their wives. They know what's going to happen to their children, and they don't want that to happen to them. They know the Romans are going to bust in, so they make a pact. They draw lots. The heads of the households are supposed to go back to their homes and kill their families, kill their wives and their children. And then the men are going to draw lots to see who's going to kill the other men. And then there's a couple then that are left that are supposed to kill themselves, so that when the Romans breach the walls, they're not going to find anybody alive. What's interesting about that is that when the Romans breach the walls, they find not only all of these zealots dead with their families, but they find food supplies there as well. So the inhabitants, the defenders of Masada, are not killed. They're not killed by hunger. They're only killed because the Romans are able to build that siege ramp, breach the walls, and get in. They had plenty of food to last longer if they needed to. All right, that's Masada. That's a pretty famous history story from this period. There was a movie made from that years and years and years ago. I'm not even sure if it's still available to watch, about the events in Masada. All right, so Masada marks the end of this war. The Romans are very, very happy. It's taken them 8 years to do this. And so Vespasian mints a coin. It's actually called the Judea Capta coin. If you look over here in Latin, that is the inscription. Judea Capta in Roman letters. It's done by Vespasian. You see his name over here, shortened. It's a shortened version of his name that's on the coin, or an abbreviation. And you see here Judea, symbolized by a woman weeping under a palm tree with a Roman soldier there having her in slavery. So these coins are minted. If you have a mind to buy one, you can actually buy original Judea Capta coins on the coin market. All right, so again, pretty proud that they have finally quelled this revolt. So in Rome, they built an arch. They build the Arch of Titus. It's built by Domitian. We know him from the book of Revelation. It's built by the Emperor Domitian to celebrate Vespasian's and Titus's victory over Judea. It's meant as a monument. We build monuments as well to our victors, to our victories, and to people who lead our victories. Well, the Romans did the same kind of thing, and so this is to celebrate what Vespasian and Titus had done. Notice a close-up of part of the Arch of Titus. This is what's called the treasure scene. And so we get this depiction of the Romans carrying off the temple menorah and also carrying off the table of showbread. So they're going to burn the temple, but they're going to carry off the treasures. They're not going to just throw those in the trash because they're made out of gold. They're valuable. So they haul those off to Rome. See what we did? We conquered Jerusalem, and we conquered this God's temple that's there as well. That's how the ancient people thought of these things. All right, that's the Arch of Titus, the treasure scene. One more photo before we look on, and that is the Colosseum of Rome. We're probably all familiar with that. We've seen pictures of the Colosseum of Rome. Some of you may have been to the Colosseum if you've traveled to Rome. If you've traveled to Rome, I suspect you've been there. The Colosseum of Rome was built using spoils from the Jewish-Roman War, including about 20 to 60,000 Jewish slaves. And it's built between 70 and 80 AD. It's commissioned in 70. It's not finished to 80. The war isn't even over in 70, but they're already getting spoils and they're already getting slaves that are coming back, being brought back to Rome. They're going to work on the Colosseum. What's interesting is, of course, we remember from Christian history that later when the Romans are persecuting Christians, some of them are dying in this Colosseum that had been built by Jewish slaves from the Jewish-Roman War. All right, let's talk a little bit for a little while. I am going long tonight. I hope y'all are going to bear with me. Give me about 15 to 20 more minutes, if you would. Let's spend a little time talking about the benefits of Roman rule. Eventually, a generally peaceful era was established. For most Jews living under the Roman Empire, it was a peaceful period most of the time, except for those rebellions. There were building projects and infrastructure that was going on throughout the empire. So we have roads that are being built. We have aqueducts that are being built. We have public buildings that are being built. Think theaters and palaces. Monumental architecture. Herod was also a prolific builder. Again, we're going to talk about him next Thursday. So we're not going to talk a lot about that tonight. He was a prolific builder. He was king of the Jews, a puppet king under the Romans. He is building a lot of stuff in Judea. So we get roads, and we get aqueducts, public buildings, lots of Roman buildings going up throughout the empire, but in Judea as well. So here we have in our next photo, this is actually a Roman milestone uncovered at Capernaum, from the Via Maris, which is the way by the sea. It's a milestone. We drive down our roads today, back in the days before GPS, if we wanted to know how much longer, that's what the kids always ask, how much longer before we're there, Dad? Well, read the milestones, the mile markers. It says we're at mile marker 100. The town we're going to is at 400. You got 300 more miles. Sit back and relax. The Romans did that as well, so they could measure how far they had gone, so they would know how far they had traveled and how far yet they had to go. We also have another photograph here. This is from Beth Horon. Remember that location of the battle against the Romans? Also from the Maccabees against the Seleucids. This is a Roman road. You can still see it. This particular road had to have steps because it's going up over a hill. So Roman roads were important. Everybody's using the Roman roads. Then we have a Roman bridge. This is located near a place, excuse my Spanish pronunciation, Las Cabezas de San Juan in Spain. So this is a Roman bridge located in Spain. That bridge is 2,000 some odd years old. Not only is it still standing, it's actually still being used for motor traffic. Okay? The Romans were incredible. They built roads to last. They built bridges to last. And so all over the Mediterranean world, you can go to Spain, you can go to France, you can go to Italy, you can go to North Africa, you can go to Turkey, you can go to Judea, you can go to Greece, and you will see remains of what the Romans built. I think there's a meme that goes around Facebook that says, Roman road, after 2,000 years, still looks pretty good. North Texas road, 2 months after it's finished, and it's got potholes already. The Romans built things to last. Another photograph that I'll pull up. This is an aerial view of the town, or the remains of the town of Sepphoris, which was the capital of Roman Galilee. Let's take another shot looking at that. This is the Chardo, or the main street through Sepphoris. Note with me, if you will, in that photograph, I love this. In that photograph, you have wheel ruts. You have wheel ruts that date back to the Roman period, because as those wagons are going, I started to say chariots, probably most people are going in wagons. As those wagons are going over and over and over on these roads, they are wearing ruts in the rock. But Sepphoris, the road's still there. Some of the ruins have fallen down, but you get this great example of a Roman road that's still there, and you can still see the ruts. By the way, something interesting about Sepphoris, I'll just throw this out here. Sepphoris was located about a 1 hour journey from the city of Nazareth. And it was built during the early 1st century. There was lots of building projects going on there. Remember what the Bible tells us about Joseph, Jesus' father? Well, Jesus' stepfather, I guess we'll say it that way. The Bible tells us that Joseph was a carpenter. We think of carpenters as people who work with wood. The word carpenter in the ancient world included everything from dealing with rock, to dealing with wood, to building buildings. It's entirely possible, although the scriptures don't say so, it's entirely possible that Joseph, as a carpenter, might have actually been working on some of the projects here in Sepphoris. All right, let's pull up another photograph. This is one of those aqueducts. This is the aqueduct at Caesarea Maritima. That means Caesarea by the sea. This is an area that Herod built up. We're going to talk more about that Thursday night. The arched portion of this aqueduct, what you see here in the picture, these arches, the aqueduct, the water channel is up on the top. The arched portion of the aqueduct is 5 miles long. Before that, there is a section that passes through a ridge via a tunnel, which is 1,312 feet long, to bring water to the city of Caesarea. Caesarea did not have enough of its own water, so they have to bring water from up in the hills down to the city. Caesarea in the first century had a population of about 100,000 people, which made it larger than Jerusalem. We'll talk more about Caesarea next week. All right, let's talk a little bit about Roman tax collection. Roman tax collection was carried out by tax farmers who would bid for the right to collect taxes. Once they were granted the right to collect taxes, they were granted the right not only to collect those taxes, but also they could collect enough to pay for them and their subordinates. So basically the people who were having to pay taxes were also paying the taxman, if you will. Probably pretty similar to what we do today. After all, our taxes pay the salaries of the IRS. But what the Roman system did was it left an open door to corruption. And so in general, these tax collectors, they were called publicani, were despised by the Jews. If you read a King James version of the Bible, you may read the word publicans sometimes in that translation. It's coming from this word publicani. That was the Roman word, the Latin word for these folks. In the New Testament, we read of 2 people who were tax farmers, tax collectors. One of those was Matthew the Apostle and Zacchaeus. Remember the wee little man that went up in the sycamore tree to see Jesus, and Jesus eats with him in his house. We read about these 2 fellows in Matthew 9:9, Matthew 10:3, Luke chapter 19. They were generally despised by the Jews, and certainly in the case of Zacchaeus, the fact that Jesus would eat with him in his house really raised a lot of eyebrows on the part of the religious elites. That was Roman tax collection. This figures into the New Testament as well. What about Roman justice? Let's talk a little bit about Roman justice. Roman law recognized various classes of people in the empire. We're going to simplify this a little bit. There were citizens. Citizens could be born citizens. They could gain citizenship through service in the legions. They could also purchase citizenship. Citizens had the right of appeal to the emperor for judgment. So you may remember in the book of Acts, that's exactly what Paul does, because Paul's a Roman citizen. He appeals to the emperor as the ultimate judge in the Roman Empire. Then we had freemen. Freemen could be free on the basis of birth. If their parents were free, they were born free. They also could be free because they had been freed. So slaves could become freemen if their master either sold them their freedom or actually just gave them their freedom. And sometimes masters did that. And then their children after them would be born free. Then we find our third class of people. These are the slaves. Slaves could be born slaves if their parents were slaves. Many people were made slaves through war. Many people were made slaves because they were foundlings. So in the Roman Empire, if you didn't want your child, if you didn't accept the child that was born, the father could say, I don't accept this child. That child would be taken out and left to die. Well, if somebody came along and found a baby crying like that, they could just take the baby. Now, in our society, we'd say, well, we're going to adopt the baby and make it our own child. Not in Rome. In Rome, those foundlings generally became slaves. And so they would belong to whoever had found them. Slavery in the Roman Empire was not racial. It was based on status. Now, sometimes within war, it was based on who was conquered, but also there were people who were Italians, ethnically, who ended up becoming slaves. All right, very, very different than our experience here in the United States in the past. All right, these slaves had no rights under the law. That's very similar to our experience. But there were some laws regulating how they could be treated. So the Romans did leave some laws there to regulate how these slaves could be treated. But I got to tell you, those laws really didn't do a lot for most of these folks. It was really, really rough to be born a slave in the Roman Empire or to become one. Life for most of them was brutal, and generally pretty short. So, interestingly enough, when we come to the early history of Christianity, when we come to the first Christians, many of the first Christians actually came from the slave class. Certainly, there were freemen who became Christians, and there were citizens who became Christians. But a lot of the early Christians, maybe even the majority of early Christians, actually were slaves. All right, let's continue on. Talk about Roman justice. The big thing that I want to talk about when we talk about Roman justice is crucifixion. We're all pretty familiar with that from the New Testament. Crucifixion was the manner of execution that was usually reserved only for non-citizens. Citizens were fortunate. They were exempted from this. Most of the time, citizens could not be crucified. Crucifixion was borrowed from the eastern lands, and it was widely used in the Roman Empire. So a good example that we might think about is the revolt of Spartacus. You've seen the Hollywood movie. It's based in an actual historical event. Of course, Hollywood always embellishes, right? Spartacus was a real historical individual. He was a slave. He led a revolt from 73 to 71 BC, okay, so well before the time of Christ, even before Judea becomes a part of the Roman province of Syria. After that revolt, which takes the Romans a while to suppress, and it's happening in Italy, 6,000 captives are crucified along the Appian Way leading to Rome. So this is how the Romans deal with making sure that slaves aren't going to rebel. We've got 6,000 slaves here that we captured. We're going to crucify them on both sides of the road, the main road going to Rome, so that any slaves who happen to walk by, who might be getting the idea that maybe we can lead a rebellion too, this is where it ends. The Romans were pretty brutal folks when it came to suppressing rebellion and maintaining order. Criminals of all sorts were punished in this way. So things that we would never consider to be a capital offense here in the United States was a capital offense in ancient Rome. And so and you would find criminals being crucified in this way. So, for example, in the New Testament, we have Jesus being crucified. Now, we know Jesus wasn't a criminal, but he's crucified with two criminals on either side of him. This was a fairly common occurrence. This wasn't an unusual occurrence for people to be crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem or the other cities of the Roman Empire. So, crucifixion itself was often preceded by scourging, which was severe in itself and sometimes caused death. When we talk about scourging, we're talking about being whipped with a whip that had pieces of bone, metal, and stone embedded in the thongs of the whip. And so when a person was scourged, when the Romans scourged someone, there was no limit as to how many times you could strike. The Jews limited it to 40 minus 1. The Romans didn't limit scourging. So you could scourge and scourge and scourge, and those pieces of metal and bone and stone that were embedded in the thongs would rip that person open. Sometimes the scourging alone was enough to cause the individual to die. Remember Jesus? He's been on trial all night. He's delivered to be crucified. He's scourged. He isn't able to carry his cross to the place of execution. That's the physical state he was in after the events of that night. Various methods of crucifixion were used. For example, the T form, something we're familiar with perhaps. There was also an X form of a cross. Sometimes people were nailed to the cross. That's the case of Jesus. Sometimes people were tied to the cross with ropes. Tying an individual to the cross with ropes, generally speaking, prolonged the process. Crucifixion, generally speaking, was a long method of execution. Sometimes people would be on the cross for days before they finally died. All right, I'm going to leave you with a quote, and then we got a couple of pictures. This is a quote from Josephus, his book, The Jewish Wars, book 5, chapter 451. This is a reference to what's going on outside the city of Jerusalem. So the soldiers, out of the wrath and hatred they bore for the Jews, nailed those they caught, one after one way and another after another, to the crosses by way of jest. They considered it comical what they were doing. When their multitude was so great that room was wanting for the crosses and crosses wanting for the bodies. Again, a description of how many people were being crucified outside the walls of Jerusalem. All right, just a couple of photos. This is a picture of the Appian Way. If you travel to Rome, you can go out and see the Appian Way. It's one of those major roads that led to Rome. It's along the Appian Way that 6,000 of Spartacus's followers are crucified along this road. Finally, the last photo that I'll share with you, this is a heel bone of a Jewish man whose name was Yehohanan. This bone was actually found in an ossuary in Jerusalem. An ossuary is a bone box. Basically, in the first century, during the time of Jesus, when a person died, their body was buried in the tomb. About a year later, after all the flesh had decayed, somebody would go back into the tomb, the family would. They would collect all the bones and put them in an ossuary, a bone box, so that then the tomb, the part of the tomb where the body had laid, could then be reused for another burial. And these ossuaries were kept, literally hundreds of these have been uncovered within the city and around the city of Jerusalem. Well, in one of those ossuaries, they found this bone with a nail going through it. And if you will notice over here, that nail curled. Probably what happened is as that is being driven through the foot and into the wood, probably hit a knot in the wood and it curled it. What's interesting about this is that archaeological evidence of crucifixion is virtually non-existent. Most of the time when an individual was crucified, their body was taken down from the cross, it was thrown in the trash dump for the animals to eat. That's how the Romans viewed anybody who was crucified. This individual, for whatever reason, must have had some standing. His family must have had some standing. He obviously did not, since he's crucified. So his family must have had some standing, and they actually go and request the body. They get the body from the Romans. They're not able to get that nail out of the foot, so they bury it with him. And of course, 2,000 years later, we gain a certain appreciation for what crucifixion meant and how horrible of a way of execution that it was. I might add to this that as we think about this, we think about the crucifixion of Jesus. First thing that happened was he died relatively soon on the cross, because when the report came to Pilate that he was already dead, Pilate was surprised about that. He expected Jesus to last longer. The second thing we read about Jesus' crucifixion in the New Testament is that Joseph goes and requests Jesus' body for burial. And Pilate grants that request, which was unusual because most of the time the person who had been crucified, their body was just cast into the dump, not given a proper burial. Joseph has standing among the Jews, and quite honestly, Pilate really crucified Jesus because of the demands of the Jewish leadership. And so that also probably left Pilate a little bit more open to the request. But because of that, Jesus is actually buried in a tomb that, of course, we understand from the New Testament and we believe as Christians was then empty Sunday morning because Jesus was raised from the dead. All right, I'm going to pull up another slide here. Maps in this presentation, again, courtesy of the maparchive.com. If you're looking for some really good historical maps, that's a really good place to go. It's a site in Britain. If you want to buy anything, you're going to pay in pounds, but they do take credit cards. So have a look at those. They make some really good maps. I don't think we're going to see many more of those in the future classes because we're just about done with most of the history. So next week on Thursday, again, I appreciate you being with me. We went for an hour tonight. I'd appreciate if you can come back next Thursday night. We're going to talk about the Herods, this family. Who are these guys? Who was Herod the Great? What does he do? Who's Herod Agrippa? Who's he? How are they related to each other? And how do they figure into the New Testament? We're going to talk about that next Thursday night. Again, thank you for tuning in. I appreciate you joining us this evening. I do hope that you'll come back next week. This video will be available on Facebook here in a little while if you came in late and wanted to watch the whole thing. Or if you want to share that with a friend. Thank you again. I wish all of y'all a good night. Hope that you'll stay safe and stay well. And take care. And God bless.